There's no escaping our digital reality. It's wrapped itself around almost every part of our modern lives. How we talk to each other, how we understand who we are, even how we decide what's real. All of it in some way now passes through phones and screens. It's an ever-shifting landscape that feels like it's begging to be explored through art, and yet a lot of filmmakers still seem strangely hesitant to let this technology sit in their movies the way it sits in our actual lives. Part of that hesitancy is definitely about timing. Movies are made slowly, but technology ages instantly. A film can take 5 years to reach the screen, and in that time the devices it features can already look outdated or awkward. No director wants their movie to feel like it's trapped inside the year it was made, in the same way some films reference memes that are already hard to watch once the culture has moved on from them. But there's also an aesthetic fear at work. A person staring into a handheld screen doesn't feel cinematic in the traditional sense. Increasingly, we go to the movies for an escape from our phones and to experience these stories, intimate or universe sprawling, at full scale. A phone runs the risk of collapsing the visual power of cinema into a small rectangle. And then there's a deeper problem, the one writers rarely say out loud. Phones are inconvenient for storytelling because they give characters too much power. They turn almost every problem into something that can be solved through a super device that sits in our pockets. Imagine how easily Home Alone would be resolved if Kevin had a smartphone instead of landlines, or if his parents had a Ring camera to alert them of the burglars. Even last week, I watched Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest and couldn't help but think how the plot of the film would have been halted in its tracks if Van Damme's men just Googled Roger Thornhill instead of thinking he was George Kaplan. What you start to notice nowadays is a pattern where films gently step around modern technology instead of confronting it head on. Phones will lose service, batteries will die, or devices will get left behind, or even a director will situate their film safely in the past where those tools do not exist yet. But the problem is, outside the theater, none of us get to avoid it. You don't get to leave your phone in another decade. Whether we want to or not, the device is already inside the room with us, collecting information and making decisions in the background. The reality is our phones know where we live. It knows what ads to push us when we're tired. It knows what kind of content will keep us scrolling just when we're about to lose interest. These devices don't just deliver information anymore, they shape our everyday lives and the society around us. While many filmmakers try to duck away from this reality, legendary South Korean director Park Chan-wook is one of the few working filmmakers who isn't afraid to confront it. In this video, I want to break down how Park Chan-wook uses technology across his films, the clever ways that he integrates it stylistically, and what he might be warning us about with ever making a so-called tech movie. Most people know Park Chan-wook as the director of Oldboy. If you were like me and grew up in the mid-2000s, everyone had heard rumblings of this film from South Korea that Quentin Tarantino was a huge fan of. Oldboy and other cult classics of that time, such as Battle Royale, started to slowly gain traction outside of Asia at the same time that movie piracy and broadband access were exploding. The rumblings of this must-see hallway fight and a groundbreaking twist were heard through conversations with older cousins and the beginnings of internet forums. It's in these spaces that Park built up a reputation as the master of revenge, the kind of director who isn't afraid to go too far. All of that is true. His reputation is built on intensity and on moral extremes where the punishment always seems to outgrow the original crime. But that reputation also hides something important. His films aren't just about what people do to each other, they're about the invisible systems that allow that damage to unfold without resistance. Oldboy sits at the center of that reputation, a film so brutal and strange that it almost dares you to look away, but then punishes you for staying with it. Part of what turned Oldboy into a global cult phenomenon was that it was spread through burned DVDs, torrent sites, early message boards, and low-quality uploads passed between strangers online. It traveled through the digital underground long before official distribution ever caught up. In a strange way, Park's career was already shaped by technology before his films ever started placing it front and center. Oldboy didn't become legendary just because people loved it, it became legendary because digital circulation brought about an ease of access to people's interests with the film. And when you look back at Oldboy now through the lens of systems and control, it starts to feel modern in an eerie way. Odae-soo isn't just locked away, he is monitored, maintained, and experimented on over time. His environment and access to information is controlled, building a sense of reality that is entirely shaped by what he's allowed to see and also what he's denied of. The logic is identical to modern technological power. He exists inside a closed loop where someone else controls the inputs, the feedback, and eventually the output. This is where Park's real strength shows itself. He understands that the most terrifying kind of revenge isn't loud or violent, it's slow and organized. The punishment doesn't come from someone standing in front of you with a weapon, it comes from an invisible force that keeps running whether you can see the person on the other side or not. By the time the mastermind behind everything finally steps into the frame in Oldboy, the damage is already complete. The revenge has been happening for years without ever announcing itself. That distance between action and consequence, between the person who designs harm and the person who lives inside it, becomes one of the defining features of Park's later work. And once you recognize that pattern, it becomes impossible not to see how naturally his cinema would eventually drift toward the technologies that make that distance feel normal. So when Park's recent films turn directly towards phones and the way they're situated within our modern world, it feels like the same obsessions he's always loved exploring resurfacing inside new skin. The spaces and stories may have changed from the gritty revenge thrillers of his past, but the underlying questions about control, vengeance, and power remain the same. That continuation comes fully into focus with his 2022 feature, Decision to Leave. In Decision to Leave, director Park treats smartphones and the small devices around us not as visual problems to be avoided, but as the very means by which human feeling now travels. Alongside his cinematographer Kim Ji-young, Park works to weave digital life into the physical aesthetics of the film, melding the two together so that the story is told through our relation with devices. There's a scene where Detective Hae-jun stands outside alone late at night, already emotionally entangled with So-rae, the widow he's meant to be investigating. They're separated by distance, by language, and by the fact that he is quite literally watching her as part of his job, yet Hae-jun feels so drawn into her that he can't help but text her late at night. How Park films this isn't through a split screen of two people texting back and forth in separate rooms. Instead, Park folds So-rae's messages directly into Hae-jun's face. The excitement of texting So-rae lights his eyes as her text bubbles drift across the frame. As each of her messages come in, we see him typing, deleting, typing again, as if he was a nervous kid texting his crush. Not once do we see So-rae. She isn't physically present, yet her text and the emotion it provokes from Hae-jun dictates the entire scene. It's a tiny trick, but it rearranges how Hae-jun's longing reads on screen. The phone isn't a prompt, it's a living connection between two private worlds, and it captures how their relationship is defined by words and distance. And it's not just this one scene where Park uses technology to form the emotional language of the film. He frequently uses texts, step counts, route maps, and translations, not to show how clever technology can be, but to show how it can define interaction. As Detective Hae-jun builds his investigation, his professional work slowly blends into something more unsettling. He checks where So-rae's been by following her location data. He listens back to recordings of her voice under the excuse of evidence. He watches how she moves through the world by studying the small trails she leaves behind on her phone. As Hae-jun falls in love with So-rae, it's not through romantic dinners or long walks on the beach, but instead he falls for a version of her partly assembled from her digital footprint. Even when she isn't physically there, she still feels close to Hae-jun because her data keeps appearing in his private space. He doesn't have to imagine her anymore, the phone does that work for him. And once the relationship is already being carried by devices, it makes sense that even language itself will begin to pass through the same machinery. See, a crucial part of the film is that So-rae isn't a native Korean speaker, so Park frequently places translation technology at the forefront of her conversations with Hae-jun. That sense of romanticism that flows between them is translated through an app and comes back in a flattened, neutral voice. It's a bleak reality where the convenience of translation can also allow characters to hide their emotions behind it. What Decision to Leave ultimately shows is that technology has changed not only how we gather information, but what we want from one another. In Park's hands, the devices we carry are not only placed on screen as part of the narrative, but he manages to weave it into his film stylistically. We sit with one man's obsession with his investigation and the women he's falling for, and it all flows through these screens. Park does something rare. He makes the ordinary tools of modern life feel dangerous, but also profoundly romantic, and he does it without ever making the tech seem like a gimmick. Once you see Decision to Leave through this lens, it becomes impossible to ignore what's been sitting inside Park's work all along. Park has always been making tech movies, long before we noticed they were tech movies. And when I say technology, I don't just mean phones and screens. I mean the tools and systems that let someone shape another person's life without ever touching them. While Oldboy is about systems of punishment and control, the other film Park is most well known for, The Handmaiden, can be seen through systems of surveillance. The house in The Handmaiden is such an interesting part of Park's filmography. Because the film is set in Korea during the 1930s, technology of course doesn't play a huge part. But Park still uses the logic of surveillance in how he shapes the physical location of the film. The house here works like a quiet surveillance machine. It is built in a way that encourages watching without being seen. Characters drift through rooms with the kind of silence that lets them collect information without ever seeming to look for it. Long before the characters fully understand who is watching them, they already sense that privacy is more fragile than it appears. As our protagonist Suki moves through this space, she begins to realize that power here does not come from strength or authority in any obvious way, but from control over the flow of information. Park stages moments of listening and looking so that they feel charged with consequence. A character pausing in a hallway, a story repeated at the wrong time, or a single line overheard through a thin wall can provide her information as dangerous as any weapon. Over time, the film makes seeing feel like a kind of currency, where the person who controls what gets revealed and what gets buried also ends up deciding which version of the story the world is allowed to believe. Across Park's early works, there may not be modern technology on screen, but the mechanics of technology are still ever present. They blend into the story through systems of surveillance, performance, and control, with the power of these systems coming from how seamlessly they shape the characters and their psyches, as well as the films themselves. That more than anything else is why Park's turn to modern technology and decision to leave feels so real, and why it hits even harder in his latest feature, No Other Choice. No Other Choice pulls the logic that runs through Park Chan-wook's filmography out of private rooms and into the structures that decide whether someone will eat tomorrow. Instead of a single, secretive architect of cruelty, this film shows how lives are remade in daylight by systems of management that present themselves as neutral. The film follows Man-soo, a longtime paper factory worker who is the sole provider for his family. When the company he works for is bought by foreign owners and the modern logic of efficiency arrives, Man-soo is laid off, and everything that used to feel steady begins to crumble. The drama of the film doesn't come from the kind of personal relationships that define Park's other work. Instead, it's driven by this overwhelming sense of a system beyond our reach. The kind of system that operates when a spreadsheet is recalculated, an efficiency plan is approved, and men who have organized their lives around the rhythm of a factory find themselves suddenly irrelevant. Unlike Park's other work, harm here is not announced with a villain's flourish or a big act of violence. Instead, it's shown through a montage of men who have grown up in factories, who take pride in their work, with technology creeping in the background before unbothered suits rock up and tell them they've been let go. We don't even see the faces of these men who lay them all off. They just drive off into the distance as our protagonist Man-soo has to start dealing with the consequences of their decision. Man-soo defines his entire sense of self through his professional utility. He has spent decades mastering the grain and weight of paper, finding deep purpose in a specialized craft that most people overlook. When he loses his job, he struggles with the passive reality of unemployment. Job applications sent into an electronic abyss are foreign to a man who's been working with paper for the past 25 years, so he instead begins to hunt the other candidates competing for the position he wants. It's of course a drastic decision made for narrative excitement, but there's something to be said about him adopting the same dehumanizing logic that left him without a job in the first place. In interviews around the film, Park has said that getting fired is a very violent act that destroys one's humanity, and as we watch Man-soo carry out these plans, it becomes clear that the violence did not begin with the murders. It began earlier, in the moment his identity as a worker was stripped away, leaving him to rebuild his sense of worth through a system that only understands people as obstacles or assets. Park consistently stages technology at the center of the story. When you're unemployed, your phone becomes your portal to social mobility. You're just one phone call away from landing back on your feet again. Man-soo, in setting up a fake job ad to lure in his victims, holds that control over them, and in one scene even uses a phone call to physically move one of them away from his home in an attempt to prevent him from learning of his wife's affair. In another scene, after the murders have already happened, investigators show up to Man-soo's home to ask questions. Unlike most police procedurals, they do not reach for printed photographs of the victims. Instead, they place an iPad on the table, and the faces of the two men that Man-soo has killed glow back at him. It may seem like a passive choice, but as Park uses his camera to linger on the iPad, the screen fades to lock, reflecting Man-soo's own face back at him, folding guilt and evidence into a single image in a way that looking at photos can't achieve. Later, as Man-soo kills his third victim, he receives a FaceTime call from his wife, who spent the night digging up the family yard in suspicion of her husband. As the two hold their phones in front of their faces, Park merges their locations so that their backs are facing one another. It's such a clever way to show how the screens join them, but at the same time they hold back the very secrets that they're hiding behind each other. Another one of the film's most brutal ironies is the image of paper being produced by machines, because paper is a technology that has always sat at the awkward border between the analog and the modern. As much as it carries our grocery lists and love notes, it also carries the boxes that bring Amazon orders to the doorstep. But in each case, it is a tactile thing that we can reach out and feel. In Park's hands, he shows how these physical materials can be produced in a setting without any human touch. The factory becomes a demonstration of economic logic. Processes that once required hands are now carried out by systems designed to run without rest or pay. When Man-soo is hired back, he's placed in a role where he has to oversee the same machines that replaced his colleagues. He celebrates alone on a floor that no longer rewards the kind of emotional value of physical labor. No other choice feels like all of Park's long-running ideas are finally taking form. In Oldboy, one man's life is ruined by someone who never needs to stay in the room. Power works at a distance. In Decision to Leave, intimacy itself is shaped by what can be recorded, replayed, and translated through a device. Here, that same kind of distance no longer belongs to a single person. Instead, it belongs to systems that make decisions without ever having to look someone in the eye. By the time the film reaches its final image of machines continuing their work without human hands, it becomes clear that the threat Park has been circling for years is no longer a secret. Here, a person doesn't even need to be intimately understood in order to be destroyed. They only need to exist in a system where value is measured before making decisions on who should be rendered unnecessary. Yet Park isn't asking us to throw our phones into the ocean. His films don't take the form of sci-fi where technology is something to be feared. Instead, it's the people and systems behind them. What makes Park stand out as a director in this new digital age is how he uses technology both as a piece of his story and also as an embodied stylistic choice. Whether it's screens that fade into people's faces or FaceTime calls at inopportune times, Director Park isn't the type to avoid the technology that defines our modern existence. Instead, he leaves us with a factory floor that keeps humming when the workers have vanished. Despite all the violence, the machine continues on. At the end of the day, Park Chan-wook doesn't believe technology makes monsters. He believes monsters are already here. The machines just gave them better tools. And that might be the scariest idea of all.